Hi, Gina.
Hi, Andy.
I'm really excited to be here with you today.
And I'm excited to be here with you.
I think we bring a lot to the table from different backgrounds to talk about trauma and, to help others in working with their trauma and their post-traumatic stress syndrome, which I think we both work with. And so today is just to give the audience an idea of what we do and just talk about ourselves and our work, and hopefully do something that creates an environment for people to experience their own possibility of healing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we both share, in addition to our expertise in working with trauma, is we bring a lot of our own personal experience, history, passion, background into the work. So it's very personal and professional, the kind of work that we do. And I'm excited about that as well.
So I'm going to start by asking the first question. And I know that you've done extensive training and work with PTSD. And what is that training?
I did a week-long training on something called prolonged exposure psychotherapy. And prolonged exposure basically posits that part of the reason that people get stuck in trauma is that there's a story that hasn't been fully told. The story hasn't been fully told either within the person themselves and to others, important others around them. It's almost as if the trauma has become a piece of meat that's kind of stuck in the throat and hasn't had the opportunity to be fully digested. And the idea of prolonged exposure work is that at the client's pace, with a lot of gentleness, a lot of concern and care, we start when the client's ready to go into the story. And I become maybe the first witness to whatever it was that was so wounding. And we really take some time to flesh it out in the hopes that by fully digesting the story, somebody can then let go of the most emotional elements of it and move on with their. So I'm going to ask you a question as well.
Okay.
I'm wondering if you could share with us a little bit about what drew you to working with trauma and how you began your work in the field.
Well, I came into it kind of through the back door. I started working with a lot of people dealing with addiction, which has kind of been one of my fortes, particularly sex and love addiction. And all of a sudden, I found that almost every single client I had trauma underneath this. And all of a sudden, time after time, people were telling me stories about sexual abuse, physical abuse that they'd never told anyone before. And so just creating the space for them to talk was the beginning of a huge healing. And it was kind of a surprise to me, and then I started to realize, wow, someone who has an eating disorder is usually trying to cover up something.
Yes. Right.
And someone who has a sexual addiction has often been molested.
Yes.
And so it was putting those two together that got me to start doing this work directly.
Right.
And so I found myself, sitting there wanting to be a witness. And I think that we both know that's what makes a good therapist, is that we are witnesses.
Yeah.
And that just being a witness helps the healing process.
Witnesses and safe containers. We hold the space. We create the safe space that allows a story to be heard without overwhelming the storyteller.
So, what is the difference between PTSD and trauma? I think a lot of people would like to understand that.
Yeah, it's interesting. There actually are some differences. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, And what it means, what it implies is that there has been a trauma, the trauma's in the past, and the trauma continues to recur in certain ways in terms of impacting the person's life. So the trauma has occurred, but it hasn't been let go of. Not everyone who's had traumatic experiences develops post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. Those research studies show that basically only a third of people who have had trauma develop PTSD. PTSD is a specific set of symptoms that include things like emotional numbing, hyperarousal, a startle response, for instance, when there's a loud noise or a door slams, hypervigilance, always being on guard that something bad might happen. There are a specific set of symptoms that PTSD encompasses that not everyone who's been traumatized experiences. Usually people that have a long history of trauma or who have gone through many traumas are more likely to develop PTSD with the onset of yet another traumatic experience. And I think we both know in our work with addiction, you more with sex and love addiction, me with some of the chemical dependency work that I've done, that recurring trauma is such an epidemic in those communities, and that often leads to the development of PTSD.
I was thinking about one of my most extreme clients who was gay bashed, and at the time didn't actually feel much. Had a lot of support around them, and healed very quickly. And it wasn't until like 12 years later that all of a sudden this person started having panic attacks, and they were horrible. They would last 6-7 hours at night. Had no idea what they were from.
Right.
It took almost a year to uncover the extreme trauma, but it was definitely PTSD because obviously it was always happening for this person.
Yeah, and sometimes PTSD cannot show up for many years, and then there might be an incident in that person's life that triggers a memory. There was somebody that an old professor of mine worked with who was in a Japanese internment camp and had gone on to have a highly successful life. One day was driving across the Bay Bridge and had a panic attack and was not able to drive across the bridge anymore. And through work and therapy, it was discovered that the cables on the bridge triggered a memory of the fencing that he was behind as a young boy in the camp. So it can show up at any point in time, and oftentimes the coping strategies that people engage in initially after a trauma, which sometimes are necessary, a kind of stoicism, stiff upper lip, just plowing through, getting through, are the very things that are going to enable you to not work through the emotional impact of a traumatic experience. And sometimes that work can only happen at some remove. And sometimes that happens right away.